Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. If you enjoy powerful stories from America's past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey through history. Tonight, we step into a world of photographs so rare, so haunting, they almost feel too shocking to be real. These images are more than pictures, they are windows into forgotten lives, frozen moments that carry the heartbeat of America's history. Let's begin. Asterisk, there are photographs buried deep in America's past that seem almost impossible to believe. They don't just show faces or moments frozen in time. They reveal truths, secrets, and emotions that words alone could never capture. When you first look at them, they feel unreal, like a dream or a story someone made up. But they are real. Every shadow, every glance, every faded smile etched into history, waiting for us to look closer. These photographs are not just images. They are the heartbeat of America's memory, proof of lives lived through hardship, hope, sorrow, and strength. The first shocking images that often surface are those of children working in the mills and factories of the early 1900s. Tiny hands stained with coal dust, small faces hardened far too early by the weight of survival. They look directly into the lens, their eyes steady and tired. These children were not meant to be bent over machines or climbing under gears slick with oil, but that is where the camera found them. A little girl, no older than 8, stands on tiptoe in front of a loom taller than she is, her dress frayed, her hair tangled, her fingers raw from thread and metal. It almost feels staged, too haunting to be real. But it was. Back then, in the booming days of American industry, factories demanded labor, and labor demanded lives. Children were cheap labor. Families desperate for money sent them in because there was no choice. A photograph captures them not as nameless children, but as souls forced into a world that stole their childhood. When we look at these images today, we feel something stir inside us: disbelief, sadness, even guilt. How could this have been America? And yet, that was the truth of it. Not far from the mills, cameras found other scenes, equally shocking. The coal mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia held boys known as breaker boys. These children sat on wooden benches above the chutes, their small fingers plucking sharp rocks from Russian coal. Black dust coated their skin, their lungs filling with grit before they had even grown into teenagers. Some of them posed with a half-smile, as if trying to make light of their condition. Others stared at the lens with hollow eyes, no childhood left in them. It is hard to believe these photos were not staged by some cruel director. But they weren't. They were everyday life in an America that was both building and breaking itself at the same time. Another photograph, one that still sends shivers. Down the spine, shows men dangling from steel beams high above New York City. No safety ropes, no nets, just a lunch pail, a cigarette, and the endless sky at their feet. Their boots balance on beams no wider than a plank of wood. Below them, the city stretches, alive with noise and progress. When you first see that image, you almost laugh in disbelief. No one could have been that reckless. No one could have trusted their balance and their courage so fully, but they did. These were the men who built America's skyline, who risked their lives for a paycheck to put bread on the table. The photograph looks like a dare, like some elaborate trick. But it wasn't. It was their daily life, and for many, their daily gamble with death. They left their families each morning knowing they might not return. The faces in the photograph don't show fear. They show toughness, grit, and maybe even a bit of pride. But behind that, you can almost sense the truth. Each man knew one slip could send him tumbling into eternity. That is what makes the photo so shocking. It doesn't just show bravery. It shows how ordinary danger once was in the American story. But perhaps the most haunting images are those that capture moments of human pain during times of despair. The Great Depression gave us some of the most unforgettable photographs ever taken in this country. One in particular still lingers in the minds of those who see it. A mother, her face weary and lined, sitting with her children clinging to her shoulders. She gazes off into the distance, her eyes filled with worry, exhaustion, and love all at once. Her children bury their faces in her arms, too tired or too ashamed to meet the camera. This photograph, often called Migrant Mother, has become one of the most iconic images in American history. The first time you see it, you may think it's a painting, something posed to tell a story. But it was no painting. It was a moment of truth, captured in the rawest way possible. That mother's face carries the weight of millions who struggled through the Dust Bowl, who packed their families into broken cars and traveled west in search of work and dignity. When we look at her now, it is as if we are looking into the soul of America itself. That image shocks us, not because it is unbelievable, but because it is all too believable. And it reminds us how fragile life can be. Another photograph from that same era shows lines of men, hats pulled low, coats worn thin, waiting in the cold for a meal at a soup kitchen. Their expressions are quiet, but their silence speaks louder than words. In their stillness, you see hunger, pride swallowed, dignity bruised, but not destroyed. Some of the men look down, ashamed to be seen in such a line. Others glance up at the camera, their eyes daring you to look away. These photographs shock us because they force us to confront what we often try to forget, that America, as strong as it became, has known hunger, has known suffering, and has lived through storms that nearly broke it. And then there are the images of war. Photographs from World War II that freeze time at the very edge of life and death. Young soldiers, barely men, storming beaches with fear in their eyes and determination in their steps. Rows of white crosses standing in foreign soil, each marking a sacrifice that feels almost too vast to comprehend. One photograph in particular shows a soldier returning home, bending down to hug his child for the first time in years. His uniform is wrinkled, his face aged beyond his years, but in that moment, his eyes shine. The little girl clings to him as if she will never let go again. That image almost feels staged, too perfect, too full of raw human emotion. But it was real. The war took millions of fathers, brothers, and sons away, and every reunion was a miracle. Every photograph of those embraces carries not just the joy of reunion, but the shadow of loss, because for every soldier who came home, there were others who never did. These images shock us because they show the full depth of love and sacrifice in a single frozen second. Some of the most unbelievable photographs are not of people, but of places. Old photographs of American towns wiped away by natural disasters tell stories that no words could capture. Tornadoes ripping through the Midwest, floods drowning entire streets, earthquakes tearing apart buildings that once stood tall. One haunting image shows Galveston, Texas. After the hurricane of 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Streets that once echoed with laughter and music now lay buried under debris. Families searched for loved ones, not knowing if they would ever be found. The camera caught it all. Broken houses, shattered lives, and yet, amid the ruins, people standing tall. It is shocking to see, because it reminds us that nature has always had the power to humble us. And yet, those who survived rebuilt, brick by brick, refusing to let tragedy destroy the spirit of their town. That is perhaps the most shocking truth. Hidden in these photographs, not just the devastation itself, but the strength that followed. These old photographs shock us because they strip away the myths we sometimes tell ourselves about the past. They reveal the dirt, the danger, the heartbreak, and the resilience. They remind us that the America we know today was built not just on victories and progress, but on hardship, sacrifice, and pain. When we look at them, we do not just see strangers. We see our grandparents, our great-grandparents, The people whose lives carved out the roads we walk today thought they lived through things that feel almost impossible to imagine. And yet, they were real. Every image is a window into that reality, a reminder that history is not just words in a book, but blood, sweat, and tears captured in a single lasting frame. As we keep turning through the pages of old America, the photographs only grow more haunting, more impossible to believe. Each one feels like a dream we should wake from. Yet there they are, proof on paper that this was the way life once was. They are shocking not because they lie, but because they tell the truth so plainly, without apology, without softness. Some of the most startling photographs ever taken are those that capture the forgotten sides of American life, the corners of history where poverty, isolation, and injustice thrived. In one set of photographs, the camera takes us into the Deep South during the early 20th century. Sharecroppers stand in the dust outside their cabins, their eyes sunken, their hands hardened by endless work that never lifted them from poverty. Their children cling to their skirts or trousers, barefoot, their clothes worn down to threads. Behind them, their wooden homes lean tiredly, roofs sagging, windows cracked, porches broken dot at first glance. The photographs almost look staged-like an artist's dramatic interpretation of hardship. But they are not. These were real families who lived and died in the cycle of labor and debt that ruled the South long after slavery had ended. The camera did not ask their permission to capture their pain. It simply froze their truth. And when we look at it today, it shocks us because we want to believe America was always moving forward, always climbing higher. Yet here was an entire generation still trapped, still waiting for freedom that had been promised, but never fully given. Another set of photographs from that era captures lynching's images so brutal and disturbing that they almost feel too shocking to be real. Yet they were real. They are among the most haunting photographs in American history, not because of what they show alone, but because of what surrounds them. In these images, you see not just the horror of the victims, but the crowds that gathered. Men, women, and even children standing beneath the trees as if attending a carnival. They smile. They pose. They treat a murder as if it were entertainment. When you first see these photographs, disbelief floods in. How could this have happened? How could human beings smile in the face of such cruelty? Yet it happened. Again and again. These images remain some of the hardest to look at, but they force us to see the truth about America's history. They shock us because they refuse to let us hide behind the easy stories of progress and patriotism. They show us the deep wounds that shaped this country, the wounds still felt generations later. But history is not only horror. Some photographs shock us with their sheer beauty, their defiance against the pain of their time. During the Harlem Renaissance, cameras captured an America that pulsed with creativity, with art, with music that carried the soul of a people who refused to be broken. One photograph shows Duke Ellington at the piano, his face glowing with joy, his fingers dancing across the keys as if he were conjuring magic out of thin air. Another shows a crowded dance hall, young men and women dressed in their finest, their faces lit with laughter, their bodies caught mid-swing. When you first see these photos, they almost look like scenes from a movie, too alive, too radiant to be simple reality. But they were. In the middle of hardship, segregation, and inequality, here was beauty and brilliance that could not be silenced. These photographs shock us not with pain, but with power, the kind of joy that feels impossible to erase. They remind us that even in the darkest times, America had its music, its art, its beating heart that refused to stop. Some of the strangest and most unbelievable photographs of American history come from the late 19th century, when photography itself was still new, and people used it in ways that today feel eerie and unsettling. Post-mortem photography was common then. Families posing with loved ones who had died, arranging them in chairs, dressing them in their best clothes, painting open eyes onto closed eyelids to make them appear alive. The images shock us because they feel macabre, almost morbid, as if they belong in a ghost story. But to those families, the camera was a way to hold on to someone they had lost forever. In an age before affordable portraits or video, a photograph was often the only image a family would ever have of a child, a wife, or a husband. So they took these final, haunting portraits, hoping to preserve love in the only way they could. When we see them today, it is easy to feel disturbed, to question how people could have found comfort in such things. But these photographs tell us something important about grief in America's past, that it was raw, unhidden, and woven into daily life in a way we can hardly imagine now. And then there are photographs of the cities that rose out of dirt and ambition. Early photographs of New York, Chicago, San Francisco streets, clogged with horses, wagons, smoke, and endless crowds. One image shows Times Square in the early 1900s, gas lamps glowing against the night, a sea of hats and coats filling the sidewalks. At first glance, it feels unreal, like some painted vision of the past. But the camera tells us it was real. This was the America of progress, alive with invention and dreams. Equally shocking are the photographs of cities after tragedy. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 reduced grand buildings to rubble fires, sweeping through the streets until little remained but ash. The photographs look almost like the end of the world-giant clouds of smoke, people standing helpless as everything they knew crumbled around them. It seems impossible that a single city could endure such destruction and rebuild. And yet, San Francisco rose again, stronger, more determined than ever. These photographs shock us because they remind us of the thin line between greatness and ruin. A line America has walked again and again. Other photographs capture the frontier spirit that shaped the West. Cowboys on horseback, Native American, chiefs in full regalia, gold miners panning in icy rivers, pioneers standing proudly beside their wagons. These images shock us because they look like myths brought to life, like scenes from a legend. And yet, every one of them was real. The faces of the cowboys show grit and hunger. The faces of Native Americans show dignity and sorrow, captured in a time when their world was being stripped away. One particularly shocking photograph shows a Native American chief, his eyes steady, his clothing rich with beads and feathers, sitting before a white photographer's lens. His gaze cuts through time, sharp and unyielding. It shocks us because it feels as if he is still looking at us, asking us not to forget what was taken, not to forget who he was and what his people endured. These photographs are reminders of a history too often hidden or softened. They are the proof that America's story was not just triumph, but also loss, displacement, and survival against impossible odds. Perhaps the most startling of all are the photographs that capture everyday people in moments of quiet humanity, moments that feel so intimate, so raw, that they almost feel too personal to be shared. A young couple kissing on a bench in Central Park in the 1940s. A farmer kneeling in the dust beside his ruined crops, his hands covering his face. A child standing barefoot in a field, clutching a ragged doll. A soldier's last letter home, held in the trembling hands of his mother. These photographs shock us not with spectacle, but with truth. They remind us that history is not just grand events or famous figures. It is ordinary people, caught in moments of love, despair, joy, and fear. They are the threads that weave together the fabric of America's story. Fragile but unbreakable dot, and through it all, one thing becomes clear. The photographs we call shocking are not unbelievable because they are false. They are unbelievable because they reveal how much has been forgotten, how much has been endured, and how much of America's heart has always been bound up in struggle and hope. The more we look at these photographs, the more we realize that they are not just images of the past. They are mirrors reflecting pieces of ourselves. The strength of those children in the mills, the courage of those men on the beams, the sorrow of the migrant mother, the laughter in Harlem, the devastation of Galveston, the resilience of San Francisco, the pride of the native chief. These are not just their stories, they are ours. The deeper we go into these photographs, the more they pull us in, the more they blur the line between the past and the present. They are shocking, not because they are strange, but because they show us truths that feel too raw, too real, to belong to history. They remind us that America was built not just on victories, but on tears, sweat, laughter, and blood. Every image is a heartbeat, and together they form the pulse of a nation that has known both glory and pain. Among the most powerful and unbelievable photographs are those that captured America's march into the modern age, when invention and progress changed the very shape of daily life. Early images of electricity being installed in cities feel almost magical. Men perched on tall poles, stringing wires through the sky as curious crowds gathered below. To us, it seems ordinary power lines stretching down every road, lights that switch on with a flick. But in those photographs, you can feel the awe of the moment, the wonder on the faces of people seeing light shine where darkness had always been. There is a photograph of Times Square glowing for the first time with electric signs. The night sky burns bright, people gazing upward with eyes wide, their faces illuminated by bulbs that never seem to dim. When we see it today, it almost feels staged, like a scene from a film. But it was real, and in that moment America stepped fully into the modern world. These images shock us not because they show pain, but because they remind us how quickly life can change, how progress can sweep through a generation like a storm. Other photographs from that era capture the wonders of invention in ways that look almost unreal. The Wright brothers standing proudly beside their fragile flying machine. Crowds watching as the first automobiles rattled down dirt roads, horses startled at the strange machines taking their place. Photographs of families gathered around it. First radios, their faces lit not by light, but by sound, as if they were listening to voices from another world. When you first see these images, it is hard to believe that such simple, fragile beginnings gave rise to the world we know today. Perhaps the most shocking photographs are the ones that remind us of how fragile life remained, even as progress advanced. One image shows a crowd of thousands gathered in St. Louis during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, every face hidden by a mask. The photograph looks eerily like something from our own recent past, a ghostly echo across a century. Lines of patients stretch out of hospitals, bodies wrapped in blankets, carried to wagons waiting in the streets. At first glance, the photographs feel too modern, too familiar to be from more than 100 years ago. Yet they are. And they remind us that America has faced these storms before, that fear, sickness, and uncertainty have always been part of the story. Another set of photographs that shock us come from the Prohibition era. Images of speakeasies hidden behind barbershops and basements, men and women clinking glasses filled with illegal whiskey. Police officers proudly pose with barrels of liquor they had seized, smashing bottles in the streets as crowds watch. One haunting photo shows the aftermath of a raid: broken glass, liquor spilling like water down the gutters, men in suits watching silently, their dreams poured into the dirt. But not all the photographs from that time show ruin. Some capture joy and rebellion: flappers with short skirts and bobbed hair dancing in smoky rooms, jazz bands playing until dawn, couples kissing in the shadows. These photographs shock us not with sorrow, but with defiance. They show a country that, even when laws tried to chain it, found ways to live, to laugh, to drink, and to dance. The Great Depression followed soon after, and the photographs turned darker again. Images of dust storms swallowing the plains, black clouds stretching across the horizon like the end of the world. Farmers kneeling in the dirt, their crops reduced to brittle stalks, their cattle dying in the heat. Children wore masks against the dust, their eyes peeking through, wide and uncertain. Entire families packed into broken-down cars, mattresses tied to the roof, driving west in search of work that might not exist. One particularly shocking photograph shows a farmer's wife staring at the horizon as a dust storm approaches. Faces blank, her body still, her children clinging to her dress. Behind her, the sky turns black. The photograph looks almost too dramatic, too perfect, to be real. But it was. That was life in the Dust Bowl survival against a sky that seemed determined to bury the land alive. And yet, even in these hardest times, there are photographs that show an unbreakable spirit. Families gathered around a table with nothing more than bread and beans, smiling as if it were a feast. Children playing barefoot in the dirt, their laughter somehow louder than hunger. A man fixing a broken truck with nothing but his hands and determination, his wife holding a baby beside him, her eyes tired but proud. These images shock us because they reveal strength where we would expect only despair. They remind us that, even in the darkest chapters, Americans found light. Then came the war again. World War II filled the lens with images that still leave us shaken. Soldiers storming beaches under fire, their bodies pressed into the sand as explosions tore the air. Rows of helmets and rifles stuck into the ground to mark graves far from home. Photographs of cities overseas, reduced to rubble. Civilians wandering among ruins that once were neighborhoods. But some of the most shocking photographs were taken not on the battlefield, but back home. Women standing on factory floors, building. Planes and ships while their husbands fought overseas. Rosie the Riveter was more than a poster, she was real. Thousands of women rolled up their sleeves, their faces shining with sweat and pride as they riveted steel and forged weapons. That would help win the war. The photographs show them in uniforms, bandanas tied, determination in their eyes. They shock us not because they are unbelievable, but because they show how America's strength has always come from ordinary people rising in extraordinary times. And then there are the photographs of victory, crowds flooding Times Square, confetti falling like snow, a sailor bending a nurse into a kiss that became one of the most famous images in history. When you see that photograph, it almost feels staged, too perfectly symbolic of joy. But it was not staged. It was real. A moment when relief and happiness burst into the streets, when the whole country seemed to exhale at once. Yet alongside the joy, there were images too painful to forget. The liberation of concentration camps, skeletal survivors staring blankly at the camera, their eyes hollow, their suffering almost beyond comprehension. American soldiers, hardened by war, standing shocked at what they had found. These photographs are some of the most shocking in existence because they force us to confront not just war, but the depths of human cruelty. When the war ended, America stepped into a new age, and the photographs shifted again. The 1950s brought images of prosperity families smiling in front of shiny new cars. Suburban homes lined neatly along quiet streets, children playing with hula hoops and toy trains. At first glance, the photographs almost seemed too perfect, too idealized, like scenes from a dream. But they were real too, though they told only part of the story. For while one America thrived, another still struggled. Photographs from the civil rights era reveal a truth too powerful to ignore. Children walking bravely into schools while angry mobs shouted at them. Marchers crossing bridges, their arms linked, facing police with batons and dogs. Martin Luther, King Jr. standing at the podium, his eyes lifted as if he could see a future not yet born. These photographs shock us not because they are unbelievable, but because they reveal the courage it took to demand simple dignity, the brutality faced by those who asked for it, and the resilience of those who refused to be silenced. The photographs from that time feel as raw and real as any ever taken. A young girl drinking from a colored water fountain. A bus in Montgomery, half empty, with a quiet woman sitting alone in defiance. A boy holding a sign that reads simply, "I am a man." These images remind us that history is not just dates or speeches. It is flesh and blood standing in the streets, daring to change the world. Every photograph shocks us in its own way, some with joy, some with sorrow, some with sheer disbelief. But together, they tell the story of a nation that has stumbled, struggled, fought, and risen again and again. They are proof that America has always been both fragile and strong, broken and unbreakable. And as we keep looking at them, turning the pages of time, we realize something even more powerful. These photographs are not just records of the past. They are lessons for the present. The more we linger on these photographs, the harder it becomes to look away. They are not just pieces of paper. They are voices, and each one speaks across time, whispering truths we might rather forget, but cannot afford to lose. They shock us, because they break through the myths we tell ourselves, because they show that America has always been a land of contrasts, greatness and grief, beauty and brutality, hope and heartbreak. As the decades rolled into the second half of the 20th century, the camera continued to capture moments that feel almost too incredible to be real. The Vietnam War gave us images that still burn in memory. One photograph shows a young girl running naked down a road, her skin burned by napalm, her mouth open in a cry too deep for words. Around her, soldiers walk in stunned silence, powerless to shield her from the agony. When people first saw this image, many refused to believe it could be real. It looked too raw, too unbearable. But it was real. It became one of the most defining images of the war, shaking the conscience of a nation and fueling a movement against the conflict. Not another shocking photograph from that era shows a South Vietnamese general executing a prisoner. In the street, a pistol raised, the trigger pulled in broad daylight as the camera clicked. The photograph freezes the moment of death in such stark detail that it feels almost staged, like a grim performance. But it was no performance. It was war, captured in the instant of its cruelest reality. For many Americans, seeing these images in newspapers and magazines shattered the distance between home and the battlefield. It was not just soldiers who suffered. It was children, families, and entire nations. The photographs shocked because they showed war without the veil of heroism, without the comfort of distance. They showed it as it was violent, merciless, and real. But even as war tore at the fabric of the country, photographs also captured the spirit of resistance and change at home. The 1960s and 1970s gave us images of marches, protests, and gatherings that shifted the nation's future. One photograph shows a line of students at Kent State University, their bodies collapsing as bullets struck them during a protest against the war. Another shows a young woman kneeling over a fallen student, her arms outstretched, her mouth wide, in a scream of grief. That image spread across the world, shocking everyone who saw it. It seemed impossible that such violence could erupt on an American campus among young people asking for peace. And yet, there it was, captured forever in a single frame. The civil rights struggle, too, carried into this time, and its photographs remain some of the most powerful in history. One image shows John Lewis, his skull fractured, being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Blood streaks down his head as he falls, while others scatter around him under the assault of police. The photograph shocks because of its sheer brutality, but also because of its courage. Those marchers faced violence without raising a hand. In return, and the camera bore witness to both their suffering and their strength. There are photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. standing at the Lincoln Memorial, his arm raised, his face alight with hope. And there are photographs of him lying still in Memphis after the assassin's bullet struck. Crowds gathered, their faces twisted with grief, their hands raised in mourning and anger. The photographs feel unreal, too sudden, too cruel, but they were real. They capture the cost of leadership, the weight of dreams, and the pain of a nation torn apart by loss. Some photographs from this era shock us not because of violence or despair, but because of joy and unity. Think of Woodstock, 1969, a sea of young people sprawled across a muddy field, their clothes bright, their hair long, their smiles unrestrained. The photographs show them dancing in the rain, singing together, wrapped in blankets against the night. It looks like a dream, a fantasy too free to be true. But it was real. For 3 days, music and hope filled the air, and cameras froze the moment forever. At the same time, photographs of the space race gave Americans something entirely new to marvel at. Astronauts in bulky suits floating above the moon, the Earth. A small blue jewel hanging in the distance. The first footprint pressed into lunar dust. These photographs almost look like science fiction, like illustrations from a storybook. But they were real proof that America had reached beyond its own sky. They shocked not with sorrow, but with awe, with the realization that mankind had stepped into the stars. The decades that followed brought more photographs, more shocks, more reminders of how fragile and extraordinary life can be. The fall of the Berlin Wall, crowds climbing and cheering as hammers chipped away at the barrier that had divided the world. The dust-covered faces of firefighters after the September 11th attacks, standing among the ruins of the towers, raising a flag from the rubble. That image, too, looked almost staged when first seen, too symbolic, too perfectly powerful. But it was real, and in that moment it gave the nation a symbol of hope in the face of unthinkable loss. The photographs from disasters, wars, triumphs, and ordinary lives all share one thing. They hold us. They grip us by the heart and refuse to let go. They shock not because they are lies, but because they are truths that feel larger than life. They remind us of what we have endured, what we have lost, and what we have become. And when we look back even further, to the earliest days of the camera in America, we see the same thing. Photographs of Civil War soldiers, young and trembling, their faces both proud and afraid. Photographs of Lincoln, his eyes heavy with the burden of a nation tearing itself apart. Photographs of freed men and women, standing tall in ragged clothes, their dignity shining through despite everything they had suffered. These images shock us not because they are foreign, but because they are familiar. They look at us across the years and remind us that we are part of their story. Every shocking photograph of America, every child in the mills, every mother in the Dust Bowl, every soldier on the battlefield, every protester in the street tells something vital. They tell us that America is not just a country of victories. It is a country of endurance. It is a country where ordinary people have faced extraordinary trials, and through those trials, they have carved out something lasting. When we see these photographs, we might feel disbelief. We might wonder how such hardship, such courage, such beauty, and such sorrow could all belong to one nation. But that disbelief fades, and what remains is recognition. Recognition that this is who we are. This is where we come from. And maybe that is the greatest shock of all, not that these photographs exist, but that they are our photographs. That the faces looking out of them are our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, people whose blood still runs in our veins. They lived through storms so fierce that survival itself was a miracle. They worked with hands that built cities, tilled fields, forged steel, and carried rifles. They laughed in speakeasies, wept in breadlines, prayed in ruined homes, and dreamed under starlit skies. The photographs remind us that America is not just history, it is memory. It is struggle. It is hope. And above all, it is people whose lives were too powerful, too heartbreaking, too beautiful to ever be forgotten. So when we look at these shocking photographs, when we stare into their faded faces and impossible moments, we are not just looking at the past. We are looking at ourselves. And in that truth, in that shock, we find something stronger than disbelief. We find belonging. We find gratitude. We find the story of America unbelievable, unforgettable, and entirely real.